So now if we look at my second example, we want to look at how contact between the natives and the Europeans brought change to Native American society in the period 1492 to 1700. So what kind of a question is this? Is it comparison, causation, or continuity and change over time? We are looking at changes here. So this would be, how did the natives and Europeans, how did their interaction bring change to the native society? So this is something important. You want to make sure. You could get confused here and talk about changes within Europe, but that's not what the question's asking. The question is asking, how did Native American society change? And then we've got briefly explain a second example of how contact between Native American and Europeans brought changes to the Native American society. So this is, again, you're basically going to be coming up with two different changes, and then give an example of how Native American societies resisted that change. All right, so think back to what we discussed at the beginning of the session. So if we start here, one example, I want to answer it first. What's my example of how contact with Europeans changed American society? I'm going to say that it's in the loss of population through disease. That's going to be one of the things that led to a change, loss of population through disease. Now I need an example of that. When did that really happen? Prove that it truly happened. And so here's my example. Smallpox was brought to North America by the European explorers and wiped out an enormous part of the native population they lacked because they lacked immunity. So now I want to tie it together. This loss in population changed native society because here's why. This is why it changes that society, because their reduced populations prevented them from successfully resisting European takeover of land. So I'm saying I've got to show how it changes their society, not just that a lot of the native population died. I've got to show, how does it change their society? Well, they end up losing their land because they can't defend it anymore because they've lost their numbers. A second example of how contact with Europeans changed Native American societies, I'm going to say, is the introduction of the horse through the Columbian Exchange, right? Show off that knowledge that you've got those words, Columbian Exchange. So as Native American society, I've got to give an example. When was the horse used and where was it used? So I'm going to say here, as Native American societies adapted horses for use in hunting and warfare, they became more mobile and successful in hunting bison. So that's going to help them out. And tribes of the Great Plains became particularly adept at using horses to challenge their enemies in warfare and enhance their ability to hunt over long distances. So this, again, shows how it changes their society. Here's an example of who does it, and this is how it changes their society, because they can now challenge their enemies better in warfare, and they can hunt over longer distances. Then an example of the Native American resistance. So how did the natives fight back to this? So my answer here, I'm going to say, is the Pueblo Revolt. So they're going to fight back through violence and warfare. There's my answer. My example of where that happened is here with the Pueblo Revolt or Pope's Rebellion. You can use either of those terms. So I can't just drop in a name. That's one thing that I tell my students. You can't just name drop. You can't just throw out Pope's Revolt, there's my answer, and not explain what it is. You have to show the reader of your exam you know what you're talking about. So once you've got Pueblo Revolt here, you've got to define it. So we've got the Pueblo Revolt or Pope's Rebellion was staged in New Mexico by natives against their Spanish colonizers. The Pueblo people had been faced with Spanish efforts to take their land and missionary efforts at Catholic conversion. The revolt, organized by the leader Pope, was coordinated and was temporarily successful. So this is my definition of my example. I've defined what it was, and it was temporarily successful in resisting Spanish influence. And so there I've set up my answer. I've answered the question that they resisted through violence and warfare. I've given my example and I've tied it back together. All right, our final example for this session